Bonjour et bienvenue dans cette session plénière de l'après-midi consacrée, dans le droit fil des discussions que vous avez pu suivre ce matin, à tout d'abord l'événement géopolitique de ces derniers mois qui est la guerre en Ukraine, le retour de la guerre en Europe, et la réflexion qui doit être menée avec un panel de distingués intervenants venus de pays européens, tous, et qui ont à penser aujourd'hui les conséquences de cette guerre, mais aussi une vision de long terme de quelles peuvent être les enceintes et les perspectives de sécurité collective en Europe. Vous avez pu écouter ce matin certains d'entre eux, et à quel point finalement cette guerre de la Russie en Ukraine est l'aboutissement aussi d'un impensé qui est la façon dont on pouvait construire et renforcer la sécurité collective du continent européen à l'issue de la guerre froide, après la fin de l'Union soviétique, l'indépendance des différentes républiques qui la composaient. Et avec cette courte introduction, je voudrais tout de suite vous présenter le premier panéliste. Il est vice-ministre des Affaires étrangères de son pays, la Lituanie, qui est le premier pays à avoir pris son indépendance à la fin de l'URSS, et qui est un pays qui est voisin de la Russie et qui est pris depuis longtemps entre cette tension finalement entre rejoindre la grande famille des Européens et notamment les institutions de l'Union européenne que son pays a rejoint en 2004 et avoir et entretenir des relations de voisinage aussi avec le pays voisin, la Russie. Et je vais commencer par vous poser la question, Excellence, Monsieur le Ministre, sur la façon dont aujourd'hui, depuis la perspective lituanienne, vous pouvez voir cet enjeu de la sécurité collective en Europe avec cette urgence pressante qui est finalement la réflexion et toutes ses conséquences sur la façon dont les pays européens doivent se positionner dans cette guerre ukrainienne.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this introduction, and well, I want to thank the organizers of this conference for a very valuable exchange of ideas, and also I would like to thank the Kingdom of Morocco for their vote in United Nations General Assembly, which voted to condemn the annexation of Ukrainian territories by Russia earlier this autumn. Well, when talking about security architecture in Europe, obviously I have to talk from the point of view of Lithuania, which is, when people don't know where Lithuania is, I tell them that Russia is our western neighbor. We have our western border with Russia. And, you know, when sometimes you feel sort of incomprehension because, you know, they start thinking about Sea of Japan and so on, you know, what they miss is the enclave of Kaliningrad, which is sandwiched between Lithuania and Poland deep in the territory of the European Union. And this is, for us, a ever-lasting, well, and sort of ever-existent military threat. It's stuffed with nuclear weapons, among other things, and Iskander rockets, let alone brigades of Russian army and nuclear-carrying fleet and aviation. And this, together with Belarus, which has recently been more and more become a colony of Russian military designs and military plans, makes the three Baltic countries along the Baltic Sea sort of a security island which is linked to the rest of EU and NATO territory only by 100 kilometer of what is called Suwalki Gap, a sort of short, very narrow strip of land which joins Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia to the rest of NATO and EU territory. So one must understand that the war which started in Ukraine, and if introduced by Russia, and if Belarus joins it as an active force, it will be some 30 kilometers from the Lithuanian capital. The warring party will be already there. That's changed the strategic balance in Europe, and the important question for us to, when we think about security architecture in Europe is, for the first time, it's being driven by new type of threats, not by institutional arrangements, not by institutional developments, but by a new type of threat which forces on us to rethink of what security architecture might let us to preserve that bit of security which there exists. But we shouldn't deceive ourselves. This is a continent which is already at a war which is greater than any other military conflict in that part of the world since World War II. It's a war in which some close to 200 million people have already been involved. If we count Belarus, which is already providing its territory for military attack on Ukraine. So Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and whatnot. So in a sense, we have to realize that the nature of the threat is what shapes our strategic thinking about security architecture in Europe. Now, what type of threat is that? I mean, there is a line of thinking which goes that, we just have to make the Ukraine and Russia sit behind the negotiating table and the threat will have gone away. I mean, we may reach a point where we can go back to business as usual. All these nice Western companies which have been forced by public outcry to withdraw from Russia, they will dust their old affiches and will go back into Russia and do business as usual, and there will be business as usual with, and oligarchs will be buying the London properties, and the nice yachts will be mooring in Nice and all that. Well, I think I'm here to bring a disappointment. This is a long-term threat, and there isn't going to be going back to business as usual at any short distance. Even if there is a regime change in Russia, the nature of the threat is not going to go away. Why? Because it is not Putin's war. It is not a war which is led by one man. It's been facilitated by one man's paranoia and delusions and his absolute isolation from common sense and reality. But it's in the process of transforming Russia from blundering, corrupt, but nevertheless a democracy into what it is now, a nearly totalitarian regime of total control and suppression of any political opposition. He has transformed Russian society into a revanchist, irredentist, nationalist body of people who are out baying for blood, who are actually as aggressive as their propagandists are. And we have this on the basis of data. So this is the nature of the threat which is not going to go away if there is going to be change of the regime. And in designing the security architecture for Europe for the future, we have to take into account that we will have to live in the conditions of near conflict situation, or at the best case, or in conflict situation for the next foreseeable future. And the history, which we tend to overlook, is there to teach us, because Russia did not start its aggression on the 24th of February this year. In 2008, immediately following the unfortunately failed Bucharest summit, there was an invasion of Georgia, which we tended to overlook, thinking, okay, well, that's a one-off. Maybe Georgians were provoking Russians too badly. Then in 2014, there was an annexation of Crimea and invasion of eastern Ukraine, which lasted until this year as a kind of rumbling, but nevertheless ferocious war, which saw tens of thousands of casualties. So this is not a new thing. We have to get finally to grips with the fact that we're living side by side with a revanchist, irredentist power next to us, which is not going to be seen off simply by making some nice noises at the negotiating table. And for this, I think this is the question for us: are the institutional arrangements that Europe had so far adequate to the task? And if you had asked me this question a year ago, I would have said, no, probably they are not. Look at how we totally blundered our response to Georgian war, first Ukrainian war, some war in Syria, and some other incidents. Now, a year later, I would say that actually we have managed to reinvent ourselves in this crisis, and that both NATO and EU have proved, which have been living for sort of decades, waiting for this sort of big trial. They have proved themselves, there was a proof of the concept. They proved themselves capable of transforming themselves into viable frameworks of building up political will, building up resources, and building up delivery mechanisms to respond to this crisis. So my answer to your question is that, well, if something is working, don't let's spoil it. We can tinker with it, we can perfect it, definitely. But I think that institutionally, we have all the institutions we need, and no institutions will be a replacement for political will. Sometimes we deceive ourselves thinking that lack of political will can be compensated by building new institutional framework. No, I mean, political will is not built by institutions. It is the institutions which channel that political will. And there is, I think, at the moment, the constellation of both political will of democratic populations in Europe, as well as requisite EU, NATO networks, which in their complementary capacities actually make it as adequate to responding to this long-term threat that European continent faces for the future.
Thank you very much. I think your response, your answer was pretty clear in terms of content. What might not be totally clear is how do you see the distinction and what should be the role of EU and the role of NATO, but I'll leave this for further comment. And also, it's been mentioning this morning also, what are the goals of war in Europe, in this war? What are the European countries trying to achieve in this war in Ukraine? Is this regime change? You pronounce this word. Is this other thing? How should we expect to bring back Russia to a negotiation table? You believe not or not if we are not strong enough? That's ideas that we leave for the debate, for the floor, and for further comment. And I would like to ask Ramona Manescu, which is the second speaker. She is a former foreign affairs minister, also from Romania. I would like to ask, I don't know if in French or English, or in English is fine, or you can speak in any language you want, obviously. I will take your point from a Romanian perspective, because Romania is neighboring Ukraine. You've been also entering into the EU in 2004 and in NATO. How do you see this question of collective security? What should be the expectation toward EU? What do you expect from the European countries to provide in terms of collective thoughts about this question?
Thank you so much, Olivier, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to be in this panel in particular. I appreciate all of my colleagues here, and I'm very, very happy to be in this format. If we think about European security, and at this conflict, we can think from both, from two perspectives. It's a European war, it's a crisis in Europe, but it's also a global crisis. And it's not something that you can divide. That is why the answer that European Union should have should go in both directions, to defend its own territory within the security strategy and with all the security tools, defense and security tools that we have, of course, the partnership with NATO, within OAC, within CSDP, but also to look further and to go deeper into the impacts and effects that this crisis and this war is provoking, and that means to go further and look on energy security, critical infrastructure security, building up capacity and capabilities in resilience and preventing, like early detecting, preventing, and fighting against this kind of conflicts and attacks. We do have, of course, the economic aspect, which goes further to the social impact. the economic aspect of this crisis is, I think, this is not European, this is global. And then, as well as energy aspect. And that's why I think we need to build up capacity to overcome the impact on economy globally. And that is why European Union already started to discuss and to rethink its own priorities in going in a deeper partnership with the third countries. And when I'm saying third countries, I'm referring to South Caucasus and of course the Global South, which is very important in this moment. It was always important, but we didn't give enough priority to the policies and to the cooperation with them, and that was a mistake, and now we are paying that mistake as well, as many others. And now we need to rethink how we build up new mechanisms in cooperation. We need to strengthen our neighbors. We need to strengthen our partners outside Europe, because if we don't strengthen economically our partners, then we will all have a problem, and we will go deep into the effects of this war. I'm talking about food security, I'm talking about supply chain of the basic goods. Just look at the fertilizers, the problem of the fertilizers, which affect us all, because Ukraine and Russia were the main producers, the main suppliers of fertilizers all over the world, and we all need to eat. We all need to keep this functioning. Energy issue, which affect us all and affect the steel industry all over the world, not only in Europe, not only the German industry, yeah, which was probably the only one relying exclusively in German gas, in Russian gas. So all of these are coming now in an emergency, and it's too much sometimes for the Europe, and sometimes it's too much for the leaders to overcome all these effects. And of course, it's useless to say, "Did we tell you?" It's useless, even though that's the case. But now we need to rethink all the security system, not only military, but also on all the other aspects which are impacting even stronger not only European economy, but global economy. And I think from this perspective, we do have already some steps that we have done.
Merci beaucoup, Ramona, pour élargir finalement un peu ce débat aussi aux aspects. La sécurité collective n'est pas seulement finalement la défense contre une menace militaire éventuelle, elle est aussi une façon de penser la sécurité des approvisionnements énergétiques, l'économie aussi, comment renforcer la résilience économique des pays d'Europe. Je voudrais aussi poser la question, vous voyez aussi que les préoccupations des pays qui sont directement au contact en réalité de la frontière ukrainienne et de cette situation de crise inédite depuis longtemps sur le continent européen. Il y a aussi un autre pays qui a une petite frontière avec l'Ukraine. Il s'agit de la Hongrie. Je vous parle en français, Peter, parce que je sais que vous parlez français. Peter Balázs est un ancien ministre des Affaires étrangères hongrois. Et on a senti aussi, notamment avec l'allocution du ministre en fonction qui a parlé hier, le ministre de la République de Hongrie, que la Hongrie avait une voix un petit peu différente finalement de ce qui a pu être exprimé par notre ami Mantas Adomėnas de la Lituanie, une voix qui appelait peut-être aussi un peu plus à essayer de trouver tous les moyens possibles pour revenir à la table de négociation et à trouver des formules de paix avec la Russie. Est-ce qu'il y a vraiment finalement une gamme des nuances dans les positions des pays européens? Comment vous voyez la façon dont les différents pays européens pensent en fait cette question de la sécurité collective? Est-ce qu'il y a un schisme entre ceux de l'Est, entre les voisins de la Russie, entre ceux de l'Ouest? On a vu aussi que ce matin, l'ancien ministre français des Affaires européennes avait une vision différente aussi de ces questions de sécurité collective.
Merci pour la question. I will answer in English because I have the impression that this afternoon, this is the common language of this panel. And
Yes, those who have listened, the actual Minister of Foreign Affairs of Hungary, could see the striking difference in the position with the majority of NATO and of EU. But I can assure you that the majority of the Hungarian population is in favor of Ukraine. And yes, it was said yesterday that about 1 million Ukrainians were received in Hungary, maybe a bit less, but I'm not discussing about the figure. I just would like to add that hundreds of thousands crossed the country, the territory of Hungary, but 30,000 stayed in Hungary. All the others went on their way to Germany and other West European countries. So there is an internal discussion about such declarations, among others that it was said that the war broke out. But somebody initiated that war. It was a clear aggression, the first total aggression against a sovereign state since the Second World War. And I could go on with some other critics. The sanctions are working. Sanctions are painful. An economic sanction is always a two-edged sword because it is painful for those who are applying, but much more efficient. In those countries, in the case of Russia, we see more and more the effects and the results of such sanctions, which help the military efforts of Ukraine. Okay, what I would like to add is another point, agreeing with all the food and energy and other aspects which are extremely important. The war in Ukraine has shown the fragility of our security system in Europe, the weakness of our security system of Europe, that one of the permanent members of the UN Security Council can act against the provisions of the UN Charter. This is Russia. And we believe that the big systemic change which happened around the year 1990 wouldn't change the overall structure of security. It would go on, the bipolar security system. Yes, it was good for half a century. It assured peace in Europe. There were only local conflicts. But what happened in the 90s, and not everybody is aware outside Europe, that 3 federal states fall into pieces. Czechoslovakia is today 2 states. One state is represented here, the Czech Republic. Yugoslavia is in 7 states today. Another representative is here from Croatia. And the Soviet Union fall into 15 new states. Altogether, these are 24 new states on the map of Europe. When Western Europe is unchanged, France and Switzerland and Italy, all the others, in Eastern Europe there are 24 new borderlines, new uniforms, new flags, new ambassadors, and so on and so on. And there was a hypothesis, and the hypothesis was that the former republics of those federal states will continue as sovereign players on the international scene. This is the case in Czechoslovakia only. In Yugoslavia, Serbia launched several wars after the dissolution of the federal country. In the Soviet Union, there were, post-Soviet area, there were some local attempts of Russia to occupy Transnistria, Abkhazia, South Ossetia, but now this is the first war, the first real war. And then we could think about the validity or the lack of a real security system. We would need something which is guaranteeing the state borders. The most uncertain situation is now in Ukraine. Where is Ukraine? Who is recognizing? And in foreign policy, one of the cornerstones is the status quo. Who is recognizing and respecting the status quo and who is not? Who would like to change the status quo? And we see that Russia would like to change the status quo. And the counter-arguments of Ukraine is to come back to what we call the status quo ante, the situation before integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine as it was, before the start of the war. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Peter. Et je crois qu'aussi, sur cette question de la guerre en Ukraine, il y a une ambiguïté. La guerre en Ukraine, finalement, elle a commencé en 2014 par les événements de Crimée, par les velléités sécessionnistes aussi des régions de l'Est ukrainiennes, soutenues activement par la Russie en sous-main. Et au final, il y a eu la tentative par les accords de Minsk, par la chancelière allemande, le président français, d'arriver à une solution européenne, finalement. Et est-ce qu'il y a aujourd'hui, finalement, qu'est-ce qui a pu se passer pour que finalement la volonté des Européens et ces accords qui dessinaient peut-être une prémisse d'essai de sécurité collective aient pu échouer? Et au fond, est-ce que des principes en fait, tels que ceux de l'intégrité territoriale, la souveraineté des États, doivent pas être au cœur aussi de cette réflexion de sécurité collective, un préalable en tout cas à toute discussion de sécurité collective en Europe? C'est, je pense aussi en creux la réflexion que vous dessinez. Vous avez évoqué la situation des Balkans. Je voulais me tourner vers Miro Kovac, qui a été également ministre des Affaires étrangères de son pays, la Croatie, qui a intégré l'Union européenne en 2013, qui a intégré l'OTAN en 2009, et qui a été donc un des premiers États, un peu après la Slovénie, à pouvoir intégrer l'Union européenne. Et c'est vrai, le point qui est soulevé aujourd'hui, en fait, il y a aussi une instabilité potentielle dans les pays des Balkans. On voit que la question de la Macédoine du Nord a toujours été problématique. Il y a eu la question du Kosovo en 1999. Comment on voit depuis la Croatie la question de la sécurité collective en Europe et cette discussion globale que nous avons aujourd'hui sur les pistes et les principes sur lesquels on peut construire demain une sécurité en Europe?
Très bien, merci beaucoup. D'abord, comment les temps ont changé? On a un modérateur français qui parle anglais et qui est ici devant vous des représentants de Nouvelle Europe, comme disait M. Rumsfeld, un collègue, l'ancien ministre de la République tchèque, un Croate, une Roumaine, un Hongrois, un Lituanien. Donc nous sommes tous membres de l'Union européenne, membres de l'OTAN, mais nous sommes la Nouvelle Europe. Et on discute avec un Français en anglais. Hein? Comment ça a changé? C'était impensable il y a 30 ans. Il était impensable qu'un Français parle aussi anglais dans une conférence internationale. Donc ça change. Donc tout le monde s'adapte. Et les Français s'adaptent eux aussi. C'est la vie. Voilà, donc pour le dire ainsi, d'abord, vous avez parlé, Monsieur Do, de la gestion de la crise en Ukraine. Qui a, dans un premier temps, géré la crise en Ukraine? La France et l'Allemagne, donc l'Europe, pour le dire, grosso modo l'Europe. Qui la gère aujourd'hui, de la part des Occidentaux? Les Américains. C'est la réalité. Il y a 30 ans, quand la Serbie a commencé la guerre avec l'armée yougoslave contre la Slovénie, puis contre la Croatie, puis contre la Bosnie-Herzégovine, en fait, à la fin au Kosovo, qui a géré dans un premier temps la crise en Yougoslavie, après en ex-Yougoslavie? La communauté européenne, dans un premier temps. Là déjà, malheureusement, l'Europe a échoué. Les États-Unis sont engagés avec Bill Clinton, et puis on a eu les accords de Dayton en 1995 après les offensives militaires de l'armée croate, en Croatie, en Bosnie-Herzégovine, avec aussi l'armée de Bosnie-Herzégovine. Donc on a libéré nos territoires nous-mêmes et on a eu cette conférence aux États-Unis, puis on a signé ces accords de Dayton à Paris, donc on les appelle officiellement les accords de Dayton-Paris. Mais c'était une concession aux Européens, donc la crise a été gérée à la fin par les Américains. Donc c'était il y a 30 ans. Donc on a refait on a commis la même erreur qu'il y a 30 ans. Ce n'est pas nous, les Européens, qui avons géré la crise sur le territoire européen. Pourquoi? Parce qu'on n'a pas, dans un sens positif, on n'a pas de conscience impériale. Le vice-ministre lituanien, notre ami Adomenas l'a bien dit, en Russie, même s'il n'y avait pas M. Poutine, s'il y avait quelqu'un d'autre au pouvoir, il est fort probable que ce monsieur, ou cette dame, c'est moi, il me semble qu'il y a une dame en Russie, mais quand même, je ne sais jamais, aurait lancé cette guerre. Pourquoi? Parce que les Russes, ou la Russie, elle a une conscience impériale. La conscience impériale. Donc c'est un empire, hein, agit comme empire. Il y a des sphères d'influence. Les Américains, la même chose, c'est un empire. Les Américains, ce matin on a parlé d'Afghanistan, on n'a pas lancé la guerre en Afghanistan pour apporter la civilisation occidentale. C'était une action antiterroriste. Voilà, il faut jouer la franchise. Les Britanniques, pourquoi ont-ils quitté l'Union européenne? Parce qu'il y avait dans l'establishment politique britannique la conscience impériale. Qui va nous dicter à nous les Britanniques quelle politique mener? C'est nous les Britanniques. On va voir si cette décision de quitter l'Union européenne va apporter du bien ou du mal aux Britanniques. On ne le sait pas. Je veux dire, donc il n'y a pas de conscience impériale. Donc ce qu'il faut à l'Europe, il faut une sorte de conscience de gestionnaire de la stabilité sur le continent. Donc il faut une sorte de doctrine Monroe positive pour le continent européen et aussi pour l'entourage, donc pour l'environnement en fait, pour les pays ou les régions qui sont dans le voisinage de l'Europe. Donc il faut cette conscience. Il ne suffit pas d'avoir des stratégies qu'on publie par la Commission européenne et en fait quand il faut les exécuter, il n'y a rien. Quand il y a eu la guerre en Syrie, je ne sais pas si Ramon était déjà ministre, mais moi j'étais ministre en 2016. On était assis à Bruxelles avec mes collègues, je ne sais pas, M. Svoboda n'était pas, c'était Zauralek. Et donc on était là et on pleurait, Aleppo va tomber. On est là, Aleppo va tomber, mais rien ne se passe, on ne fait rien. On est là, enfermé dans une salle à Luxembourg, on dit Aleppo va tomber. Au lieu de réfléchir de manière différente, il faut envoyer des soldats pour des raisons humanitaires en Syrie, être sur place. Qu'est-ce qu'on a fait en Syrie? On a laissé la place aux Russes, aux Iraniens, aux Turcs. Voilà. Et après, on se plaint. Maintenant, on a la crise et la guerre de la Russie contre l'Ukraine. Qu'est-ce qu'on fait? Il y a des paquets de sanctions, très bien, on fait ça, mais il n'y a toujours pas de réaction collective européenne. Il n'y a pas de force de défense européenne. Il nous faut à nous des forces de défense européennes pour agir sur place, pour être présent. On aurait pu faire ça en 2014, on ne l'a pas fait. Donc, pour maintenant revenir en fait aux Balkans occidentaux. Les Balkans occidentaux, il y a la Bosnie-Herzégovine, il y a la Serbie, il y a le Monténégro, il y a la Macédoine du Nord, il y a l'Albanie, n'est-ce pas? Il y a aussi le Kosovo. Est-ce que nous, les Européens, est-ce qu'on a réussi à imposer un modèle avec nos voisins, parce que la Roumanie aussi et la Hongrie aussi, en quelque sorte, nous sommes tous des pays voisins. Est-ce qu'on a réussi à imposer un modèle dans les Balkans occidentaux qui va permettre que ces pays rejoignent l'Union européenne? Non. On avait l'impression que les Russes et les Turcs avaient plus de poids dans cette région que nous, les Européens. Et ça ne va pas comme ça. Donc c'est le ventre de l'Europe, c'est sur le continent européen, les pays qui donc, entourés par des États membres de l'Union européenne, et nous ne sommes pas en mesure de les aider à trouver un modèle de coopération et qu'ils deviennent prospères. Parce que, pour revenir à ma thèse principale, parce qu'il n'y a pas de conscience de gestionnaire, on vit dans une sorte de paradis kantien. Le philosophe allemand Kant est né à Kaliningrad, Königsberg, c'était en fait la Prusse orientale, donc la paix éternelle. Il faut redevenir réaliste. Pour peser en politique internationale, il faut avoir une économie forte, oui, mais aussi il faut avoir de forces armées fortes, il faut aussi parfois intervenir. Il n'y a pas d'autre solution. Donc on a une Europe économique, mais on n'a pas d'Europe politique, ce qu'il nous faut le plus rapidement possible, une Europe politique pour aussi travailler à long terme, pour avoir de vrais partenariats, non seulement sur le papier, avec l'Afrique, avec l'Asie, avec l'Amérique du Nord, avec l'Amérique du Sud. Voilà, c'est ça, je pense, la façon dont il faut voir les choses et dont il faut agir. Merci. Shukran.
Well, I will follow up in English because it pleased you, Miro, and I'm addressing our next speaker. He has been also a Minister of Foreign Affairs of his country, the Czech Republic. How can we build on what's being said just by Miro? We see Germany is investing 100 billion in his armed forces by decision of Chancellor Scholz, and it's quite new. You know, it's unseen from the end of the Second World War. We've seen also Ursula von der Leyen declaring that her commission would be a geopolitical commission. We are seeing a lot of crises, unsolved crises, all around the Europe, not only Ukraine, but we can have a look on Syria, as Miro said. We can have a look on Libya. We can have a look on Cyprus, Transnistria. A lot of European surrounding states are experiencing political crisis situation. Is it because of Europe? Is this because of the weakness of the European Commission, the weakness of the collective weakness of European, as Miro said?
The question is a very important one, because it is a political decision that every single country, every single NATO member state is to contribute 2% of GDP. It is a political decision. And having had the experience with the war in Ukraine, so there's a very strong pressure to invest, even in my country, because just 10 countries from 30 are capable of meeting the commitment, just 10. So the pressure is very enormous and it is very strong. So to buy new arms, to invest to the security. But the problem is that it is politically under the umbrella of NATO. If we want to use NATO, we need unanimity. It does mean that we need the approval of the United States and Canada. And the question is, to what extent every single interest of Europe corresponds with the interest of US and Canada. I give you an example, because Europe has the common security and defense policy, and it is a well-functioning system. If you read the treaty, it's a very flexible system how to take the common decisions, common positions, or common actions. But the question is, if we have enough money for this policy, because we will be concentrated on building NATO system. And in this respect, it's very important to mention this point here in Morocco. Why? Because, so we need support coming from Africa. We closed the mission in Mali, I mean Europe, France, and the interest of Africa is to welcome Europe to take responsibility for building security on the continent. That's the task, so we have to accomplish. Why? Because the Russians, the Wagner mercenaries, are not to replace Europe. Please believe me, they are not capable of replacing Europe because of technology, because of the system of war. Please see the Russian army in Ukraine. So technologically, the NATO and Europe is prevailing, dramatically prevailing over the Russian army. And if the African countries believe that Russia is a partner for building security in Africa, so Africa is making a very huge mistake. So this is, as I want to stress, this is the double track. So we need to support each other, not to perceive Europe as the former colonial powers, but to perceive Europe as the partners because we are closer to Africa. And in my view, so the war in Ukraine is very important for the changing the style of thinking in Europe. What is the preference of Europe? To be a little bit independent and to have enough energy and money for being involved maybe in Africa, or just to build up the NATO as a system of the protection if Europe and NATO is attacked. So I believe that you do understand so the difference. So I am still very in favor of Europe, and I am asking the African countries to be more generous and more courageous, not to lose the credibility, and please be ready to cooperate with European countries.
Thank you, Cyril. And that allows me to go back also to Minister Adomenas. And I've been asking how to make the difference between what is expected from the EU and what is expected from NATO from a Lithuanian perspective. You in Lithuania have been also involved backing also the European task force in Mali, for example, behind just after the French intervention that used to be taking place there. You've been so experiencing some part of the tryings of this European projection abroad. What do you think about what should be the European countries doing inside the EU in terms of maybe the French say autonomy strategique? Do you believe in strategic autonomy of Europe?
Thank you. Well, yes, I mean, one of the first decisions of the government at which I serve when it came was to commit troops to the French-led Takuba mission in Mali. Unfortunately, it also coincided with the coup d'etat and introduction of Russian Wagner forces. So our troops are committed, but they've never been deployed. They're ready to be committed if there is a sort of French-led mission somewhere else, and they are on a standby. So we have this we feel this responsibility that security is not just sort of what happens next door. And I think for a long time, it's not coincidental that we have all these sort of Eastern Europeans and new Europe represented here. For a long time, the stereotype was that we're only concerned with what is happening sort of across the sort of the fence from us. But no, I think we have to take global responsibilities seriously if we want, in essence, a real dialogue. If we want to get people from this continent interested and concerned at what is happening in our neighborhood, we have to be equally concerned in what is happening here. I mean, security challenges in Mali are no less important than what is happening to us, regardless of the size of the conflict. So we recognize this. is EU capable of launching that? I mean, sort of, as I said, I'm a bit of a conservative in that respect. I think that gradual reform and gradual sort of, improvements is the way forward rather than creating a totally new kind of geopolitical sort of institutional structures in the time of conflict. You know, it's an old proverb about changing your horses in midstream. The ecosystem, complementary ecosystem of EU overlaid with NATO structures and share of burdens works at the moment, because we have a huge strategic sort of, task ahead of us. You asked, at some point after my contribution, what are the goals? What should be the goals of the democratic world, of the free world in the Russia-Ukraine war? And there is a lot of talk about sort of tactical goals. And I don't think that we should be aiming at regime change, because regime change per se will only yield us a sort of another dictator, which can be sort of more ferocious, can be less, but regime change never works as such. Tactical goal, and we must realize that this is a tactical, should be Ukrainian armed victory in restoration of the integrity of its territory. But that's only a tactical goal. It will not guarantee us security for a long term. We have to look at strategic goals. And again, yesterday there was a panel on which your foreign minister appeared, rather sort of infelicitously, if I may say so, because he presented lots of incorrect information. But the panel was entitled Cold War II. Cold War II is, I don't believe in repetition of history. I don't believe that history comes back sort of, in the regurgitations of Cold War, but there is a fundamental similarity there. Cold War was caused by the fact that fundamental geopolitical blocs had profoundly different reading of what human society is for, what political organizations should be imposed on human beings, and how political power should be exercised. The free world and the communist bloc. Now we are approaching the same conditions again. And that's to say, the entrenchment of totalitarian regime in China under sort of new neo-Maoist leader, and complete political control introduced in the Russian society under this sort of irredentist, nationalist, imperialist ideology, make sort of any meaningful dialogue and any confidence between the free world and those blocs an impossibility. So we should be looking at the long term, and our strategic goal should be actually democratization of Russia. I mean, Russians are not people who are incapable fundamentally to live in a democratic society. The fact that they bungled the 90s, that democratization was incomplete, and that we failed at helping them to achieve full transition to democracy, because we thought, okay, free market is there, that's it, it's enough democratization for Russia, and we left it at that. And we allowed the KGB crooks to take over first economy, and then the state, and then the society, and then its ideology. So this should not be allowed to happen. We should learn from this past mistake, and we should raise our strategic goal. It's a long-term goal. I may not live to see it, but it's a worthwhile one. Unless we have a peaceful, democratic Russia in Europe, there's going to be no lasting peace. And the past history is a proof of that.
Thank you, Mentas, for that comment. And I go next to Peter to build on that.
Thank you very much. So we know well that Cold War was based on mutual threat, and that mutual nuclear threat was so strong and balanced that war never broke out. But here comes the problem. The Cold War ended with the victory of the West, and the Soviet Union collapsed because could not maintain the race, the armament race, and in parallel a race in living standards. But nobody has ever declared the victory of the West, and Russia has never recognized its defeat, the Soviet Union. And we didn't have a peace treaty at the end of the Cold War. At the end of the Second World War, we had a well-prepared, pre-negotiated peace. Churchill and Roosevelt met in Casablanca in 43, then with Stalin in Tehran, Yalta, Potsdam, everything was prepared for signature at the end. And then coming to the EU. The EU was used, the expansion, the enlargement of the EU was used as the avant-garde of extending the West towards the East. First EU membership, and then for few NATO membership, but the EU went first. And then we came to the conflict, because the conflict broke out in Vilnius when the association agreement between the EU and Ukraine was not signed by the then Ukrainian president Viktor Yanukovych. He was convinced and manipulated by Putin. And this is when the people went out to the Maidan in Kiev, and the whole problem started. Russia occupied the Crimea, and so it went on. We haven't got a post-Cold War status quo signed, stamped, accepted, as we had it after the Second World War, reconfirmed 30 years later in Helsinki by another agreement that, okay, we accept the borders as we are. Russia doesn't accept the borders as they are. And this is the problem. Would like to change by force. And some people raise the question, why do not we speak with Russia? Why do not we negotiate with Putin? They should sit down. There are some preconditions for any negotiation. First is to recognize the partner as somebody sitting at the other side of the table. Russia is not recognizing Ukraine as a negotiating partner. And as a reaction, Zelensky is not ready to sit down with Putin for the moment. But we know by experience that diplomats are asked to come into the play when the military says that we cannot achieve more. As long as the two parts are convinced that they could change something, occupied one more city, going a little bit further, then they get the order to go on, try to shape a better situation, and then we'll sit down for negotiation, not before. And when the generals report that, boss, we cannot move further, then they say, okay, let's try to negotiate. And this moment hasn't come yet in the case of Ukraine.
Thank you for that comment. And I would like to ask you, Ramona, from a Romanian perspective, is the EU doing enough, do you think, to engaging this dialogue on also on helping? You know that EU integration has been a main driver for Eastern European countries to reform and to promote some political change, not beyond market change and conversion to market economy. This hasn't been the case exactly for Russia because EU very soon said Russia has no destiny inside the European Union. That has been for long a question that Putin raised. Should Russia enter the European Union? Should Russia sign an association treaty with the European Union, or should Russia build its own strategic influence era? And how is the European Union doing enough from your perspective to help this Eastern European country and Balkanic country to solidify their democratic values and this collective security built on democratic values?
Thank you. You know, these days we were all discussing about the multilateral formats and the multilateralism and its weaknesses. European Union, it's by itself a multilateral format, and with all the goods has also weaknesses. So yeah, maybe we can do more and we can do better. That's for sure. And when it comes to Western Balkans, when it comes to Eastern Europe, we can do more. That's for sure as well. If I'm going back to to the discussion started by my colleagues, I would say, from Romanian perspective, that we are seeing the things in this way. Yeah, in the Cold War, we managed to win, even though it wasn't recognized, but we had two elements which now are missing. It was a permanent channel of communication between Russia and US, and that channel of communication was constantly open, and it was in place a mechanism to prevent escalation. That we don't have it anymore after the Cold War. And second, we did have dialogue, we did have negotiation, we did have constant talks with the Soviet Union at that time. So what in this moment with this conflict, it seems that we forgot about. We are not ready, or I don't know. We don't do it properly, and here I think the European Union can play a very good role, because when it's about military defense, yeah, I know the European Union builds up its own strategy, but in the same time, I think this is the first armed conflict on the European continent since we have in place this mechanism, and it's the first trial, and we are not yet there. But we have NATO, and we should rely on NATO, because we have European countries into the NATO. And from Romanian perspective, I can tell you, and Romania is one of the countries that are contributing and fulfill its commitments on financing and supporting financially NATO. We do believe that NATO is very important, at least for our country, having in mind the position that geographically Romania it's having, and our history with Russia. So if we would have been in the position to rely only on the European mechanism of defense, then we wouldn't have been so relaxed these days in Romania. So we rely very much on NATO, and we think that NATO is playing its role. And of course, it should be coordinated with European Union, and European Union's role should be more on the negotiation and dialogue part, which I think, honestly, I think we need to take a lead on that, because, yeah, if United States is present militarily more in Ukraine, then we need to be present at the negotiation table as the European Union, not only a few countries, and when a country is going there and trying to open the channel of negotiation, to be put it in the corner and say that that's not good. No, it is good, it's a courageous act to start having a dialogue. If you have an enemy, you want to talk with the enemy, no matter if you disagree on most of the points, but you still need to negotiate. Because lack of dialogue, it's worse than a dialogue, whatever that would be. And in the same time, European Union should have also its own role in building up bridges and partnership outside Europe to strengthen the relations with the neighboring countries and with the countries, the third countries. Because as my colleague said, we rely on each other. This is a global conflict. This is not a local, regional conflict. So we rely on each other. We will need to go out from this conflict, not in the knees, but with something with added value, like better cooperation and closer ties with our partners.
Et Miro, par rapport à cette question, je voulais revenir sur le fait, finalement on voit que cette guerre en Europe, cette menace perçue de la part de la Russie, notamment par tous les pays du voisinage, cette garantie que ces pays recherchent aussi, quelque part, de la protection américaine à travers l'OTAN, elle est une donnée fondamentale finalement de cette problématique de sécurité collective. Dans les Balkans, on a vu que historiquement, les Balkans sont une région où les influences se croisent. L'influence russe aussi est forte à travers, on l'a vu plusieurs fois à travers son soutien à la Serbie, cette proximité historique aussi qu'entretient la Russie avec les pays slaves. Vous avez rappelé l'influence américaine pour finaliser les accords de Dayton, mais aussi finalement dans l'initiative aussi de contrer les initiatives serbes, notamment sur le Kosovo. Comment, finalement, on a un peu l'impression que pour se projeter finalement dans une discussion collective où on a une Europe qui soit un véritable partenaire de paix et de sécurité collective avec ses voisins, avec le continent africain, il faut d'abord que l'Europe arrive à résoudre ses propres problèmes. Et notamment sur les Balkans, on voit que la guerre en Ukraine a accéléré les processus d'adhésion de pays comme la Macédoine du Nord, le fait qu'on avance plus vite aussi avec l'Albanie, avec des pays de la région. Comment vous voyez la perspective, en fait, cette perspective-là, de voir ces pays balkaniques rejoindre l'Union européenne, ces pays voisins? Est-ce que ça peut être un premier pas vers, finalement, au moins un élargissement positif, en réalité, et des garanties de sécurité future, au moins dans cette partie de l'Europe?
Merci, mais je vais quand même maintenant, par solidarité, mes collègues, je vais passer à l'anglais, comme ça je ne veux pas être isolé quand même. Hein. Donc il faut toujours éviter l'isolation. C'est pourquoi je vais en fait, I'll switch to English, okay, avec votre permission.
Bien sûr.
Merci. I think that the membership in the long run of our neighbors in the European family, pathetically said, is something which is inevitable. The problem is, of course, that what the European Union has to accomplish is not only enhancing reforms when it comes to the legislation in those countries, it is also a nation building, a state building. It's a state building effort. We have to help these states to become efficient states. That's it basically. So in general terms, I would say it's always about efficiency. It's not about corruption. Corruption, you can find it anywhere in the world. It is about efficiency, how efficient your administration is and how efficient it combats corruption. That's it basically. In the European Union, I would say the member states are quite efficient. And the new member states, and I said this morning to Mr. Svoboda, okay, the Czech Republic has now attained 92% when you look at the power purchasing capacity, 92% of the average of the European Union, the Czech Republic. Slovenia, 89%. But Hungary is 76%. But the biggest winners when it comes to transformation, Romania and Lithuania. They have made the biggest progress. So that means that none of the problems that always exist in their countries too, they have enhanced their efficiency. So what we have to do, we have to help them to become more efficient as states. They need help to become efficient states. That applies in particular to Bosnia and Herzegovina, to Albania, to Kosovo, and to North Macedonia. We can say, because they have a certain tradition, Serbia has a solid tradition when it comes to administration. But of course, in the case of Serbia, it is their consciousness of being different which they cultivate very much. They want to be some kind of Iran in the Middle East. They want to be different from the Arab countries. And if they want to become members of the European family, they have to understand they have to share our values. It's a difficult process for them, I can understand that, but they have to change. So when it comes to the European Union, as I said before, we have to make a revolution in our heads. We have to reappropriate the capacity to think strategically and to act strategically. But we should not be underestimated, the European Union. The European Union has become a very strong power, in particular when it comes to the economy. The euro is a very solid currency. It is perhaps not a currency which suits all the member states. In Italy, It has not been very useful to the Italian economy. When it comes to Germany, very useful. But when you look at it globally, a strong economy. And once you enter the European Union, once you enter it, it is, I would say, practically impossible to leave it. Look at the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom was a member of the European Union, but it was not in Schengen, it was not in the Euro, and even today, they have a lot of problems after having left the European Union. So once you're in, it is basically impossible to leave it because the integration mechanisms are so strong. You can also see it now, how we manage the Ukraine crisis. I'm not happy with it. I'm not happy. I think we should be much more assertive. We should speak to American friends and tell them, look, we are partners, we have to work together, but we have to do much more, the Europeans, when it comes to Ukraine, the European continent. But we are united. We act together. The Hungarian government has a different stance, but in the end, even the Hungarians, Mr. Orban, they accepted that we introduce the 8th package of sanctions. So it takes some time, but it works. So the European Union has a perspective. It's a very strange structure, something which has never existed before. And now we have to do something new. We have to make some kind of, Nietzsche spoke about the Übermensch. Il nous faut une sorte de Über-Europa. Donc il faut comprendre, il faut se transcender. L'Europe doit se transcender, has to transcend itself and say, we are now launching a new phase of our development. We are part of the West, the Western civilization, together with the Americans, basically, and the Canadians, but we have to act much more assertively together and do much more together, and of course, include our neighbors in the Western Balkans into the European Union, but also working hard on making those states efficient states which are able to function properly like our states function. Thank you.
Thank you. And the follow-up question would be obviously when it comes to foreign affairs and defense policy, Europe is mandatory deciding by unanimity. It's European rule. And new members means also new members to include in that collective discussion, and to be honest, it's quite a slow process. It's very hard to make progress, and you all have been part of the European summit, so you do know that it's a slow process to make those ideas progress. And how do you see the reform European country, is the European Commission proposing something else, or new, or EU members proposing something else to decide faster, to make fast decisions in Europe, as it's obviously could be required by a pressing issue like wars in Ukraine or some urgent situation? What do you think, Cyril? Should the EU reform itself when it comes to foreign affairs and defense policy?
First of all, I answer your question. Later, I will comment what has been said by Peter. I am repeating on the Czech TV that Ukraine is not capable of joining EU before I die, and I am in good health condition. Why? Because Ukraine is not capable of meeting Copenhagen criteria. Full stop. So it is a game. I am strictly against that type of game, saying Ukraine, of course, Ukraine has a status of candidate country. I do agree, but promising that Ukraine is capable of joining EU in a very short or short-term time is a mistake, because it is manipulation with the meaning of society. The Ukrainian society could dreaming that that they are now knocking the door of Europe and they will join the EU, and the answer will be maybe later. You know, Turkey starts the dialogue in 1962. And Turkey has the status of candidate country since, I think, 2006, or 2000, candidate country 99. And Turkey is not member of EU. So I am very skeptical speaking about the fast and rapid enlargement of EU. Also the problem in Balkan with Serbia, so there are a lot of problems. So we are going, my recommendation, slowly but surely. It's better than promising miracles. The second point. So I am now dreaming about the two meetings. One is Putin and his commander-in-chief, and Zelensky and his commander-in-chief. And the commanders are saying, we are not capable of going faster. So do you believe that this is a momentum for starting the negotiations? That Zelensky said, I am now ready to negotiate, to say I am not capable of going faster, for example, to liberalize the whole territory of Ukraine. Do you believe that something like that is possible in Moscow? No, it is not the case. It is a political decision, and it is, as I said, it is a question of courage to, of course, to support Ukraine militarily. So, of course, Ukraine is to defend its country against the aggressive aggression. But waiting for the right time, so the question is when the right time comes, when? So that's, I'm afraid that there is no good solution. Russia is not capable of defeating Ukraine. Ukraine is not capable of defeating Russia. So there's a possibility of frozen conflict like between North and South Korea, which is bad solution, or the peace treaty. And very last sentence. After the First War, Europe created peace against Germany, and it was the root for the Nazism. So please, we have to be a little bit more courageous to find a solution which is not a solution against somebody, because later we can face much more difficult situation, and it is not in the interest of Europe.
Thank you. I think it's time to open the floor to the public, and I'm sure those questions that are going to be raised in the room. I see a young woman over there.
Thank you very much.
Please present yourself and
yes, of course.
Short question.
Teuta Vodo from Sciences Po Paris. I have a question for all of you, actually. I'd like to ask, since you mentioned a lot this collaboration between Eastern countries, it is very important even to give a lecture to Russia in this way. And don't you think, since you have been in a position, in many different positions, keys actually, to basically shine, don't you think that the best way that Eastern countries can do is to give this message to the Eastern world, to Russia in this specific case? Because actually even the fact that enlargement is not so popular today is because the Eastern countries are not doing so good. Romania became part of the EU but had problems with corruption later on. Poland and Hungary, they are not doing it all good, especially Hungary in this case. So how can these countries give a lecture to Russia or to anyone else when actually the reason why even candidate countries are actually still knocking on the door of the EU is because, partly at least, from you. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. Would like to take the floor. Maybe you start first, and then Peter.
If you ask yourself why the conditions in Eastern European countries were different in 1990 from, let's say, Western European countries, the answer is Russia. And that's to say Soviet Bolshevik expansionism, which enslaved some of the countries. and try to obliterate some of the national identities and the sovereignties and civil societies, such as Ukrainian, Lithuanian, Estonian, and others, and locked others like Hungary, Poland, Czechoslovakia into kind of colonial dependence. And whenever they tried to free themselves, they would send in armies. So in essence, if you look at the pre-war trajectory, Lithuania, Hungary, Poland were very much in the same sort of trajectory of development as, for example, Denmark, Belgium, and some other countries. In a sense, it was just disrupted history, which introduced this, what Timothy Snyder calls bloodlands, into the Central and Eastern Europe. The two totalitarian regimes, Nazi as well as Soviet, which has never underwent the same sort of moral trial and condemnation as the Nazi regime, and which killed millions and millions of these people, that left us in sort of destroyed and tattered conditions, to which we, in 30 years, are still trying to recover and regain our place among the rightful nations. So yes, we do have a moral right to lecture Russia.
Peter, maybe?
Yes. We are all here coming from so-called new member states, which are not very new anymore, because several decades passed since the accession of these countries. But the big enlargement of the EU to the east has brought something which hasn't existed before, and this is the non-cooperating member state. The model has been shaped by Hungary and followed by Poland, is a temptation for others as well. How did it come? Of course, after the accession, some people were a bit upset that EU membership hasn't brought immediate big changes in those countries. There were some naive hopes that if we join the EU, overnight we'll live as Austrians do or Germans do, and it didn't happen. For some people it was a good change, entrepreneurs and others. For some others, pensioners, poor people, it was not. And then come a few populist politicians and misuse that situation and say, you see, you haven't got what you expected. Why should we comply with all those sophisticated conditions? We can take the benefits, but we shouldn't pay the price. The benefits is EU funds. The benefits is the big EU market where our jobless people can find some work. And the benefit is our presence, permanent presence in Brussels, speaking from the decoration of the EU Council and sending messages from there. And we shouldn't keep all the obligations. This is the non-complying member state. It took time for the EU to wake up and to apply conditionality. And it is attached now to the new EU budget, which is complemented with the reconstruction fund on the COVID issue. And now we are in between. We are looking forward to see whether the EU will be really serious on asking those conditions. And of course, the European Commission is doing the technical work, but the decision is in the hands of the member states. And it will depend, first in the coming EU summit, to see the position of the member states. And people are speculating, because it's pretty sure that Poland would support Hungary in this non-compliance. Maybe Italy not, in spite of the government change, because they need the EU money. What about other countries? We cannot know. But the EU should teach first a lesson to its own members, and then show an example to the outside world, including Russia.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. At that point, I should mention also that maybe the Eastern European country didn't invent the non-cooperative member states style, because France did it decades ago through the policy of empty chair from General de Gaulle, and there have been always European crises and sometimes EU also advancing through this crisis. It's a bit of a joke, but...
Just a short reaction. So there have been other member states, like France, for instance, the empty chair policy, also resisting to some extent. But what is happening,
Legally.
and in the question there was the word corruption.
Yeah.
This is much more than corruption, what is happening today in some countries, including Hungary. This is not the small bribery, but this is state capture, as the political science calls it, to capture the whole state, to occupy the institutions, the courts, the chief prosecutor, the constitutional court, everything, in order to divert EU money to friends and family members.
Thank you. I was being ironical, obviously. Ramona, maybe you want to, I'm going Ramona and then Miro and finally Søren.
Yeah, a part of all the problems that we have in Eastern countries, we are not perfect, that's for sure. I think that joining European Union, it was a win-win situation in most of the cases. And at least if we are talking about the relation with Russia and looking at this conflict, I think that indeed Central and Eastern European countries, which are for former communist bloc, they have at least the knowledge, the experience, the insights, and the capabilities and capacity to know better or to at least to know in advance the next move of Russia. So at least from this perspective, European Union and our friends from the West should be open to listen, because we have said most of the things that happens today has been said 20 and 15 and 10 years ago by our countries, by us, but they were not listened, because we believed, or the West believed, that Russia has changed dramatically, which is not the case due to its imperialistic mindset. So at least from this perspective, we are good to be listened, and we are in the position to express ourselves and to tell our opinion, because if we look at other problems that we all have in our countries, and Germany and France and Sweden and all the countries, they have problems, then if we look only on that, then we will never solve any problem. We need to look at what is a plus in each of us, yeah? Because then we all win from that. So that's my answer. Yes, we are entitled, and we know. We only need to be listened, at least on the last...
Thank you, Ramona. Miro, a comment on that?
Just briefly, so I suppose that the young lady who asked a question, she must be from Russia. Am I right?
Albania.
No, ¿Cómo?
She's from Albania.
From Albania. Shqiperia. Shumir. Okay. Someone who has not the experience of the European Union, has a difficulty to understand how that is possible. So you join the European Union as an independent state, and you give up competences in favor of the common institutions of the European Union. So you give up competences of your state to a supranational organization, to supranational institutions. And that explains that, for instance, the European Commission decides upon a mechanism, and then, in the end, the European Union, by a very complicated vote, punishes your country, which is a member of the European Union. And that's why a country like Turkey, with the imperial mindset, cannot accept to enter the European Union. That's why a country like Russia could not envisage to become a member of the European Union, but it would never give up its sovereignty in favor of supranational institutions in such a way. And that's why also, I said it some minutes ago, the UK, by a decision of the majority population, left the European Union. Because the mindset is, we decide ourselves about our fate. But we have accepted, there are also people who are against it, of course, in our countries, also my country in Croatia, a minority, but they exist. We give up, or we have given up, sovereignty in favor of the European Union. And so we have done that, and now we have to live with that. And sometimes, so if you, from a majority perspective, if you do not behave correctly, you accept being punished. So in a certain way, you accept, to put it very practically, you accept to be masochistic. Thank you.
We are slowly approaching the end of our panel session. Maybe,
Yes.
obviously, I'll leave the floor to Cyril.
Two small remarks. What has been said right now. So we are giving up part of sovereignty of not in favor of EU, but in favor of common interests. This is a slightly different perception. The second, why it is very profitable to be in EU, is that the symmetry is full of irreplaceable persons. Politicians are dying, politicians are sometimes are defeated, but institutions, they do exist. And that's the chance for Europe, if it's capable of being integrated, that despite all the problems and maybe temporary problems today, maybe in Hungary, maybe in Poland, I don't know where, but it is a minor issue. So this, because the common interest is prevailing over the temporary problems.
Thank you very much, you all. Listening to you, and I do think they deserve some applause. I'm just, it's the end of the session, unfortunately, but you can ask the panelists. You will find them in the lobby, and you can have a discussion with them. And I think you provide a lot of reason to be hopeful towards the EU, and you have been all putting into perspective also how the EU, by these countries, sharing a common interest, a common decision process, ensure somehow also, in a way, the collective security of the continent. It's lacking a lot of things. It's hard because EU is mostly a soft power, based on economic power, in this time of the setback with hard power and hard policy, going back in the first row in the world stage, it's obviously a hard time for Europe, but I do think that you provided some hope and de l'espoir, en tout cas, pour voir cette perspective de sécurité collective se concrétiser à travers l'Union européenne et ses pays membres, tous collectivement. Merci beaucoup.